Fulgencio Batista's name is synonymous with both progress and oppression in Cuba's turbulent history. A figure marked by contradictions, Batista's legacy ranges from early social reforms and economic modernization to the corruption and brutality that fueled the Cuban Revolution. In this video, we'll explore the complex and contested legacy of Batista by diving into the key moments of his career and analyzing the positive and negative impacts he had on Cuba. Fulgencio Batista was born on January 16, 1901, in Baines, a small town in Cuba's Oriente province. Fulgencio Batista was born to Belisario Batista and Carmela Zaldivar. Both of his parents were of mixed race, with Spanish, African, and possibly Taino ancestry, reflecting Cuba's diverse population. Belisario Batista, his father, was a laborer who worked various jobs, including as a cane cutter. Carmela Zaldivar, his mother, also came from a humble background and had indigenous and African roots. The racial diversity in Batista's family background is significant, as it shaped his identity and gave him a certain degree of empathy with Cuba's working class and marginalized communities during his early rise in politics. However, Batista's complex racial background was rarely emphasized in his political career, especially after he rose to power. Batista first entered the political scene in 1933, leading the Sergeants' Revolt, a coup that toppled the government of President Gerardo Machado. Although he wasn't president at the time, Batista quickly became the most powerful man in Cuba, effectively controlling the government through a series of puppet presidents. In 1940, Batista ran for president in what would be one of Cuba's first democratic elections.
For 6 years, Colonel Fulgencio Batista has been leader of the Army of Cuba. For 6 years, the army has run the country and Batista has been virtual dictator. Now he is to retire, and he presents medals to his officers at the farewell parade. Here is one strong man who is well loved, who has ruled wisely and preserved freedom. But as the army marches past for the last time, few people really believe that the colonel is returning to private life. They think he is leaving the army so as to be free to run for president. Cuba feels that her strong man will remain in command.
He won and served as president from 1940 to 1944. During this period, Batista introduced the 1940 Constitution, which was one of the most progressive in Latin America. It expanded labor rights, ensured women's suffrage, and laid the groundwork for social welfare programs. His administration saw increased spending on education, aimed at reducing illiteracy and poverty. This phase of his career is often regarded as the peak of his legitimacy and popularity. After completing his term in 1944, Batista voluntarily left office and moved to the United States. His exit allowed for a peaceful transfer of power, marking a brief period of political stability in Cuba. However, by the early 1950s, Batista's desire for power resurfaced, leading him back to Cuba with a different agenda. On March 10, 1952, Batista staged a military coup, overthrowing the government just before scheduled elections in which he was not expected to win. He quickly suspended the 1940 Constitution, cancelled elections, and ruled by decree. This marked the beginning of his authoritarian reign. While his early presidency was remembered for reform, his return to power became synonymous with dictatorship. Batista's coup was met with mixed reactions. Some segments of the population, particularly the military and wealthy elites, supported his return to power, believing he could bring stability and protect their interests. However, many others, including students, intellectuals, and the working class, viewed his actions as a betrayal of democratic principles. Protests erupted across the country, with demonstrators demanding the restoration of the Constitution and the holding of free elections. Batista responded with a heavy hand, using the military and police to suppress opposition. Political activists were arrested, and censorship was imposed on the press. Despite the repression, resistance to Batista's rule continued to grow. Underground movements and guerrilla groups began to form, laying the groundwork for future revolutionary efforts. Among these groups was a young lawyer named Fidel Castro, who would later become one of Batista's most formidable opponents. Castro and his followers launched a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, but this event marked the beginning of a sustained revolutionary movement against Batista's regime. Batista's government tried to portray the revolutionaries as criminals, but their cause gained sympathy and support from many Cubans who were disillusioned with the dictatorship. Over the next few years, the revolutionary movement grew stronger, culminating in the eventual overthrow of Batista in 1959. Batista's coup in 1952 set the stage for a tumultuous period in Cuban history, one that would ultimately lead to the rise of a new leader and a new era for the island nation. Under Batista's rule, Cuba experienced significant economic growth, particularly driven by foreign investments from the United States. Batista promoted industries like sugar, real estate, and tourism, turning Havana into a vibrant center for entertainment. However, this economic growth was heavily concentrated in the hands of a small elite, and Batista's government became notorious for its ties to organized crime. U.S. businesses and the mafia controlled large sectors of the Cuban economy, including hotels, casinos, and the sugar industry. While Havana flourished, much of the wealth was concentrated among the rich, leaving the majority of Cubans, especially in rural areas, in poverty. The prosperity enjoyed by Havana's elite came at a high cost. Batista's regime relied on widespread corruption and cronyism, leading to a sharp increase in social inequality. Illiteracy, poor healthcare, and inadequate housing persisted, especially in rural communities. As discontent grew, Batista turned to repression. His secret police, known as the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities, or BRAC, used brutal tactics to silence dissent. Arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings became common, creating an atmosphere of fear and driving more people to oppose his regime. In the mid-1950s, opposition to Batista's rule began to coalesce around revolutionary movements, most notably led by Fidel Castro. In 1956, Castro launched his insurgency against Batista, rallying support with promises of land reform, social justice, and an end to corruption. As Batista's repression grew more severe, so did popular resistance. By 1958, Castro's forces were gaining ground, and Batista's grip on power began to weaken. On January 1, 1959, facing mounting pressure from Castro's revolutionary forces, international condemnation, and growing unrest, Batista fled Cuba. He first went into exile in the Dominican Republic, then Portugal, and finally settled in Spain. His sudden departure marked the end of his regime and cleared the way for Castro's revolutionary government. Despite the corruption and repression, Batista's legacy isn't entirely negative. During his rule, particularly in the early 1940s, he implemented significant social and educational reforms. His government invested in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, leading to some improvements in living standards. U.S. investments in the 1950s helped modernize Havana, making it a hub of culture and entertainment in the Caribbean. These contributions are often cited by those who view Batista more favorably. Additionally, his rural development projects aimed to improve the lives of farmers and reduce poverty in the countryside. Labor reforms during his tenure also provided better working conditions and rights for Cuban workers, which garnered support from some sectors of society. However, Batista's return to power in 1952 marked the beginning of a period defined by dictatorship, corruption, and social inequality. His reliance on U.S. investments and organized crime left Cuba economically dependent and divided. The social and economic disparities that deepened under his rule contributed directly to the conditions that led to the Cuban Revolution. His repressive tactics fueled popular anger and made the revolutionary movement more appealing to many Cubans. Batista's government is often seen as the catalyst for the Cuban Revolution. The corruption, economic inequality, and human rights abuses of his regime created the perfect environment for revolutionary fervor. Fidel Castro's promises of social reform, land redistribution, and an end to corruption resonated with a population disillusioned by Batista's broken promises. The failure to address these grievances made Batista a widely reviled figure by the time of his downfall in 1959. Fulgencio Batista's legacy remains deeply contested. On one hand, he is remembered for his early efforts at reform and modernization. On the other, his later years are characterized by authoritarianism, corruption, and repression. For many, Batista represents the worst aspects of dictatorship and foreign exploitation. Yet, his role in shaping modern Cuba is undeniable. Ultimately, his regime paved the way for the revolution that would forever alter Cuba's trajectory, making him a key figure in the nation's complex history. To summarize Batista's legacy, His early presidency was marked by social and constitutional reforms that were ahead of their time. His return to power saw economic growth driven by U.S. investments, but at the cost of severe social inequality and corruption. His repressive tactics and failure to address social grievances directly contributed to the rise of the Cuban Revolution. Batista remains a symbol of the contradictions in Cuba's 20th century history. Modernization marred by exploitation, progress undermined by repression. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Cuban history, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos on important historical figures and events.